This morning we'll be continuing our series in Luke with Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. But before we dive into that, we need to talk about a story from Numbers chapter 15 about gathering sticks. So we're going to read this story from Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. While the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody because it had not been made clear what should be done to him. And Yahweh said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as Yahweh commanded Moses. Just wanted to start with a nice story. Okay? That's a pretty extreme story, right? Like, this man's collecting stones, or picking up sticks, and then next thing you know, he's being stoned to death. So let's think about that for a minute. Let's break this story down a little bit so we can understand it better. And then this will also help us to understand the story we're going to look at in Luke today. So first off, did gathering sticks violate the Sabbath? Well, let's go back to the law when it's instituted of the Sabbath. What is the regulation? We're going to look at Exodus. We're going to look at Exodus chapter 35, verses 1 through 3. Moses assembled the congregation of the people of Israel and said to them, "These are the things that Yahweh has commanded you to do. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath day of solemn rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in all your dwelling places on the Sabbath day." So this is where God institutes the Sabbath. He's giving specific instruction about the Sabbath and how it should be practiced, and that it should be taken very seriously, right? He says, anyone doing work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. Now, why is the Sabbath? Why have the Sabbath to begin with? This day of rest, right? Which was Saturday, right? Saturday is the Sabbath for the Jews. Why have this? In an agricultural society where you're actively hunting for your food, growing your food, gathering food every day, working every day is just part of survival, right? It's just part of like making sure your family is going to eat, making sure your kids are going to have food, that you're going to be able to survive, right? It's a matter of survival. And so not working on one day was a big deal. Right, we have this built into Western culture now, where we have regular days of rest. Nobody works 7 days a week, right? Not by design, at least. And so they have this built in now. God instituting this not just as a means of rest, right, which it certainly is, that an acknowledgement that the way we've been designed by God, our physical bodies are designed to need rest, and taking a day off of work once a week is crucial for our health, but also it's a sign of trust, right? It's a sign of trusting that God will provide with your efforts for those 6 days. That if you put forward your effort for those 6 days, you cannot work on that seventh day, spend it in rest and in fellowship with God, right? Focusing on Him, and you will be okay, right? But it was specifically a sign of trust, and largely a sign of trust, much more than it is today for anyone who practices any form of rest as part of their spiritual practice. We typically don't practice it as part of trusting God's provision. But for this society and at this time, it absolutely was the case. So here we see that gathering sticks is what this guy was doing. This regulation tells us that kindling a fire is part of the problem here, and so that's one of the reasons they shouldn't do this. It's effortful to gather sticks. You could say it's maybe a form of work, but it's not cut and dry. Moses and Aaron aren't sure what to do with this man, so they put him in custody and ask God what should be done with him. And God tells Moses that the man should be put to death by stoning, meaning that everyone comes out. It's a public rejection of this man's sin, right? That everyone will have a hand in putting this man to death. And so they're going to, as a group, reject this man's sin. Now, the one thing we don't fully get here is what this man's motives, right? We don't know fully. We're not given the backstory. We're not giving his argument of why he was doing this. We're not given any of that. But we kind of are, in the sense that the passage that immediately precedes this story in Numbers chapter 15 gives us a hint as to why this story is then told at this point in Numbers 15. So if we go back further in Numbers 15 from where we were, if we go back to verse 27, we see some additional kind of law being given, instruction to the Israelites. If one person sins unintentionally, he shall offer a female goat a year old for a sin offering. And the priest shall make atonement for Yahweh for the person who makes a mistake when he sins unintentionally, to make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is a native or a sojourner, reviles Yahweh, and that person shall be cut off among his people, because he has despised the word of Yahweh and has been broken his commandment. That person shall be utterly cut off, his iniquity shall be on him. Then from that moment on is where we get that story we just read previously about this man gathering sticks. So what does that tell us? That tells us they're trying to illustrate, Moses is trying to illustrate, here's what sin with a high hand looks like versus a mistake. Means that this man, when he's out there, he's picking up, he's gathering sticks for his fire, he's gathering them up, and someone says, "Hey, well, what are you doing? Hey, you know it's the Sabbath today." And he didn't go, "Oh no, I'm so sorry, I better go see the priest, I need to ask for forgiveness, that was a mistake, I did not intend to do that, I lost track of the days, I lost track of what day it was." That's not what happened. This man was gathering the sticks. They said, "Hey, what are you doing? It's the Sabbath, why are you gathering sticks?" And he said, "Who cares about the Sabbath? Who cares about it? I can't trust God, and who cares, screw that, I don't need it." He just did it deliberately. He's doing it with that sin with a high hand, that sin of just obstinance, of active rebellion against God. Right? That's the kind of sin that we're talking about here. But overall, this story shows us that the Sabbath is a big deal. Right? I share this story to explain why so much controversy existed around the Sabbath day during Jesus' time. But the Sabbath was a big deal to God. He gives a lot of instruction about it. There's a lot of importance around it connected to their covenant with Him, connected to God's trusting God's provision. Breaking the Sabbath was no small thing, as illustrated by this gathering sticks story. And so that helps us because even to this day, among Orthodox Jewish communities, the Sabbath is practiced in these kind of really extreme ways, which we can understand better knowing the story of gathering sticks, right? And we see that if that is punishable by death, then we have to be careful that we're not working on the Sabbath. If you don't take into account this idea of the heart behind it, we can see why this would be a big deal. And even to this day in Israel, these kind of extreme measures are put into place. So for an example, if you go to Israel and you're staying in a hotel and it's on the Sabbath and there are elevators, there will be some elevators that are set as Sabbath elevators. And those elevators will, when you get in, stop at every floor. Because pushing a button will violate the Sabbath. Because pushing the button sends an electrical current, a little spark through the wires to activate whatever you're trying to activate. And that little spark is kindling a fire. And so we can't be kindling a fire on the Sabbath, and so we're not going to actively cause any electricity to go. Now, if you do go there, I've heard that if you, as a Gentile, you get in an elevator that is set normally, Orthodox Jews will just jump in there with you and ask you to push the button, which is interesting. That's an interesting choice, right? And they're like, "Yeah, push the button, and then we'll go stone you." Right? Okay, let's dive into our actual story today from Luke chapter 6, as we'll see Jesus deal with the Sabbath here. Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. On a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered him, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Okay, so first off, we see Jesus and his disciples. They're walking, and in Israel at that time, depending on where you're walking, you might be walking essentially between grain fields, right? Even just on regular paths, not necessarily Roman roads, just on paths through the grain field. There's grain on either side, and as they're walking, they're just kind of plucking the heads of grain, rubbing the chaff off, and just eating the grain raw. Sounds kind of strange, but it was common practice at this time. It's actually specifically provided for in the law of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 23 tells us this. Okay. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. Right, so right there, Moses permits, like, hey, as you're walking, if you just pick some of the grain from your neighbor's field, it's not a big deal, but don't go out there and take a sickle to it and actually start harvesting their grain. Right? It's giving a little provision there for this actual specific thing, meaning if this was not the Sabbath, no one would ever question it. Right? This is just snacking on the road, right? You maybe think of it the way we do, like eating sunflower seeds. Right? This isn't even a meal. This isn't really satisfying. Like it's not going to be a meal for them. They're just kind of snacking as they go, rubbing this grain and eating it. But the Pharisees, they have a problem with it. And the thing I want you to notice here is that the Pharisees are actually with Jesus. They're on the road with him. Right? This isn't, if you just look at how this passage is written and what it talks about, they're literally actively walking through these grain fields, which means there's only two options here, that the Pharisees are walking with Jesus as they're walking through the grain fields, or the Pharisees are hiding between the rows of grain and then popping up, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And that's, I think, unlikely. Right? They're not trying to like ambush Jesus here. They're just walking with him because they're interested. At this point, they're still interested. They don't know what Jesus is fully all about. They've got some issues with what he said, but they're interested in this. And this asking the question isn't even a problem. It's not even defiant. It's how rabbis interacted with their students. They would commonly bring up these questions and discuss the law behind it and ask further questions, and that's how they would learn. So it's not a weird thing for them to say, why are you doing what we've said that's not lawful on the Sabbath? Why are you doing that? Why are your disciples doing this? Why are they eating this grain on the Sabbath? Not a problem to be asking this question, because again, if gathering wood on the Sabbath could get you stoned, then is plucking grain actually okay or not? And Jesus responds with a story. He says, you guys remember King David and the showbread? Remember when David was on the run for his life and he went and ate the showbread? And for them, they would have absolutely known this story. This is a common story for them. And King David is like the biggest hero that they've had, and they're all still waiting for the heir of David who's going to rule forever and fulfilling God's covenant with David. This is a big deal. They know David. They know his whole story. Then it's not necessarily true for us, so let's go back and read it. 1 Samuel chapter 21. David came to Nob, and Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said, why are you alone and no one with you? David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, let no one know anything about the matter of which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place, and then what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here. The priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest, truly women have been kept from us always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed before Yahweh to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. So Jesus uses this story to respond to this criticism, right? Hey, you know what David did when he was hungry? And what David does here is he's on the run from King Saul. He kind of deceives Ahimelech the priest, but he's really doing it in a way to protect him. Because if he tells him, hey, I'm on the run from King Saul, and will you aid and abet my criminal flight? That would put him in danger. So he says, no, I'm on a special mission from the king. Do you have any food here? And Ahimelech says, well, I only have the bread of the presence. I only have the showbread. I only have the bread that's in the temple that is only meant for the priest to eat. But if this is an emergency, you can eat it, as long as you guys are ceremonially clean, which is what he asks them about whether they've been with women. meaning sexually. He asks them that. And so they say yes, and so he says, then you can eat it. And what Jesus is doing here is using this story to say there are exceptions. Right? Because the law on this is very clear. They are not allowed to eat this bread. This bread is only for the priests. It's a perpetual due. We have this law in Leviticus 24, verse 5. You shall take fine flour, bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf. You shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile, on the table of pure gold before Yahweh. You shall put frankincense on each pile, that it may go on the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to Yahweh. Every Sabbath day Aaron shall arrange it before Yahweh regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever. It shall be for Aaron and his sons. They shall eat it in a holy place, since it is for him a most holy portion out of Yahweh's food offerings, a perpetual due. I mean, it's clear. This bread is only for the priests, only for the descendants of Aaron. And yet, David is permitted to eat it, and there aren't any consequences, right? No one ever says, oh, David, you were wrong to do that. It is an exception that is made because of the situation. This is an emergency. David's on the run for his life. If David had walked in to the temple and said, hey, give me the bread of the presence. I want to eat it. I want to try it. I've never tried it. You guys are always eating it. I'm David. You know what a big deal I am? I killed Goliath. Let me eat the bread. That wouldn't have been okay. Right? That's a different attitude altogether versus coming and be like, please, do you have any food? My men and I are starving. We're on this special mission to save my life. Like, essentially what's going on here is a different situation. The heart is what matters. God cares about the heart of these things. As he tells Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 29, we see this illustrated that God is concerned with the heart first and foremost. Isaiah realized this criticism from God where he says, because this people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, for their fear is a command, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. Here, Isaiah is relaying this comment from God of saying, I care about your heart, right? You have these you're following these rules, and you're giving me all this lip service. You're going through the motions, like you have this fear of me that's just based on this commandment taught by men. Like, it's not a true relationship. You don't have true respect for me. You don't have true love for me. You're not truly with me. Your heart is far from me. And that's the problem, not whether or not you're technically keeping the law. And so as the disciples are walking through these fields and they're picking the grain, they're talking to each other, they're talking to Jesus, they're asking him questions, they're learning from him, and they're just snacking on this grain, their hearts are not far from God. Their hearts are right with him. And so Jesus uses this example to show, hey, it's about the heart of the Sabbath, of trust in me, of resting in him. That's what matters. But then Jesus goes a step farther. Right, that's good enough. That's a good enough response of, hey, can you do this? Is this lawful on the Sabbath? Hey, there are exceptions. It's more about the heart. Think about King David. That's a good enough response. And it probably would have satisfied the Pharisees. They would go, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, we'll think about that, Jesus. Yeah, I'm going to go back and read that passage in Samuel. I'm going to go look into that a little bit more. That's a good point. I'll have to think about that. But Jesus goes a step further, and he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. When he calls himself the Son of Man, he's referring to his messiahship. He's referring to the fact that he is the Messiah. And he's saying, I am the Son of Man. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, meaning I am in charge of the Sabbath. He's essentially saying, don't try to challenge me about the Sabbath. I wrote the book. Right? I wrote the law of the Sabbath. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Which is just like, and this is an extreme thing to say. I know this doesn't seem like a big deal to us because these are all words that we're just familiar with in church. Right? Sure, Jesus said he's the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the Son of Man, is Lord of the Sabbath. That seems like something Jesus would say. Right? If you just read that somewhere, you go, I bet that Jesus said that. Right? But for the Pharisees, and in this moment, this is a groundbreaking thing for him to say. Because not only is he calling himself the Son of Man, which they know is a reference to the Messiah, but he's also saying he is Lord of, meaning in charge of, has authority over the Sabbath, which is an ordinance instituted by Yahweh himself, all the way back given to Moses. And he's saying, I can override any of that because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. To claim that kind of authority is to claim divine authority. That's a big deal. And he's going to go further. Luke's going to tell us another story here in verses 6 through 11 about Jesus and the Sabbath. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" And after looking around at them, he said to them, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and all his hand was restored. And they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So Jesus is teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath, a normal thing for him to do. He's teaching in the synagogue. There's Pharisees there. There's scribes there. They're waiting to see what Jesus is going to do. They're hearing what he has to teach. But they also see in through the door walks old withered hand Willie. Everybody knows him. Everybody knows him. They're all, Willie's here. Let's see what happens. He's got that hand. Everyone notices it. You can't take your eyes off of it. Everybody knows about this hand, and they go, let's wait and see what Jesus is going to do, because you know he can't help himself. You know he's going to want to heal this guy. And Jesus sees him sit down. He sees him in there. He's teaching. He sees the guy. He knows what the Pharisees are thinking. He calls him up to the front. And he said, "Is it lawful? Is it legal for me to heal on the Sabbath? Can I do good on the Sabbath? Or can I do harm on the Sabbath? Can I save life or can I destroy it on the Sabbath?" He immediately jumps from beyond just, can I heal this guy? Are you guys going to have a problem if I heal this guy? Do you think it's okay for me to do good on the Sabbath? To, can I save life on the Sabbath? Right, he's putting in their heads this question of, if you saw someone's life in danger, you saw your child up on a great height and he's about to fall and he starts to fall, would you run and catch your child if he was falling? Running on the Sabbath is right out. I mean, that's work. That's putting in way too much effort on the Sabbath. You better not do that. But if you saw that, you would absolutely do it to save your child's life. You'd save someone's life on the Sabbath, wouldn't you? Is essentially what he asked. He asked this question and then he looks around and no one says a word, which is not necessarily expected. Again, they often taught with and used dialogue, used questions and answers to teach. So he's not necessarily expecting him to stay shut up on this, but they don't say a word because the Pharisees, they don't care. They don't care about the answer to this question. They want to see, is he going to cross the line? Is he going to cross the line that they have drawn, not that God has drawn? And sure enough, he says, all right, stretch out your hand. He doesn't touch him. He doesn't do anything. He just says, stretch out your hand. It's hard to argue that that's work. But they do, right? Because they've already decided healing is work. Right? Because if you're going to practice medicine, that's work. And so any form of healing then is work. All he says is stretch out your hand. This guy stretches his hand out and it's transformed immediately. In the moment, he gains functionality over his hand once again. We don't know how long this man has had this hand that's withered, but he is now restored. And they are filled with fury. That's wild. That's wild to think. You see someone that you know in town, you've seen him for years, you've probably had to help him with stuff because he's got this hand that doesn't even function. They had to help him move and anything like that. And now you see his hand restored and your immediate thought is anger. Immediately anger fires up inside of you. Fury fires up inside of you that you have hate toward this person who healed him by just a word. Something's wrong with your heart if you have that response. Right? This man has a working hand for the first time in years and they're angry about it. Something miraculous happened to someone who is suffering and you're filled with fury. Check your heart. Something is wrong there. They begin plotting what they might do to Jesus. That's really the beginning of the plot against Jesus. We'll look lastly here at verses 12 through 19. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Simon, who he named Peter, Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a level place, and with a great crowd of his disciples, and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured, and all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out of him, and he healed them all. So up until this point, and really through the last couple chapters of Luke here, we've seen Jesus kind of slowly narrow down his pool of disciples, right? He's got a lot of followers. He's got a lot of people who have come out to see him heal and to be healed by him, to see him cast out demons, to hear him teach. He's had all this time, and he's slowly kind of reduced that number naturally just by teaching and doing the things that he was already going to do. Right? We saw him heal a leper, right? By actually touching him, getting close to this person who's considered unclean and who would be banished from society, that no one would go near. Jesus goes near him. He touches him. Surely there are people that were freaked out by that and went, I can't follow this guy. I can't be, no. That's too gross. That's too unclean. I can't be a part of that. Jesus forgives the sins of the paralytic. Again, shocking people by saying to the paralytic lowered through the ceiling, your sins are forgiven. Surely there are people that walk away at that point, go, that seems like blasphemy to me. I can't be a part of that. I'm leaving. He hung out with tax collectors and sinners. Right? He calls Levi to follow him as a tax collector. He goes to a party at Levi's house, spends time with tax collectors and other sinners. And again, people see that and go, well, I can't be a part of someone who's going to go to a party like that. They walk away. He declares himself here Lord of the Sabbath. He heals on the Sabbath. Again, people are turned away. We see these people, but there's a lot of people that are coming to hear him. There are a lot of people that are following him. It's bigger than just the 12, right? And it will continue to be bigger than just the 12. But here he selects his apostles, right? Apostle means sent out one. They're going to have a special role in his ministry. He selects these 12. He goes to the mountain to pray about it, talk to God about it beforehand. Still selects Judas Iscariot, even after that. But he's going to continue to have many followers, many disciples. But these apostles will have a special role. And so then we see in verse 17, he still got this great crowd, right, called the great multitude of people that have come to hear him teach and to be healed by him. And they're hearing them. And so there's more people. Even though you've got the 12, there's more people that are following him and hearing from him. Some of them sporadically, but some of them the entire time. There are some followers of his who are with him the entire time from the very beginning to the end. They're just not selected as one of the 12 apostles. We know this from Acts chapter 1, verses 21 through 26, where it says, this is after the ascension, but before the Holy Spirit has come, they go to select a new apostle after Judas has betrayed him and gone off and committed suicide. It says, so one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up from us, one of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. They put forward two, Joseph called Barsabbas, who was called Justus, and Matthias. It's three names. You notice that? Barsabbas, who was also called Joseph, called Barsabbas, also called Justus. That's a lot of names. And Matthias. They prayed and said, you, Lord, know the hearts of all. Show which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. They cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. But it says there, these guys have been with them from the beginning, right? And not just these two. There are more, right? There are people that are following Jesus, that are his disciples, following him from the beginning of his ministry throughout, that go beyond just the 12 apostles, which is often what we think of. But he's got more people that are with him, that are following him, that are listening to him. And that is the key. When we consider our own discipleship, it's about following him. It's about listening to him. It's about acknowledging his authority. Right? I hope that's something that you've seen as we've gone through the beginning of Luke here, is that so much of this is about Jesus acknowledging his authority, about Jesus demanding his authority over these things. Whether he has authority over demons, he has authority over disease, he has authority over nature, he has authority over the Sabbath. He is over all of it. He reigns, he rules, he is king. That is a key part of acknowledging him and being a follower of him. In John chapter 10, Jesus will say, "My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me." I'll wrap up with this 3 takeaways for today's message. Number 1, recognize the heart of the Sabbath as trust and rest in God. Or we consider our own practice of rest like it's about trusting in him and it's about resting in him. But if it's not connected to him, then it's not worth anything. Whatever our practice of rest is, whatever our Sabbath practice is, if it's not connected to him, it's not meaningful. Number 2, acknowledge Jesus' authority over all things. Recognize that he is Lord of the Sabbath. He's Lord of all. He reigns. And then lastly, follow Jesus and listen for his voice. I'm going to pray here in just a second, and then we'll take communion in remembrance of Jesus' broken body and shed blood for us, that by which we find forgiveness, by which we find grace and mercy that can save us. And then we'll sing a closing song. After that, there'll be a prayer team available right up here. If you'd like prayer for anything, they'd love to pray for you. Would you bow with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning, God, and we thank you for your word. We thank you that when we consider our own practice of Sabbath rest, God, that it be about trust in you, about resting in you and our relationship with you. Father, as we take communion now, we pray that you would remind us of the grace and mercy that you have for us, the love that you have for us that caused you to send Jesus for us. Pray these things in his blessed name. Amen.